François-Dominique Toussaint Louverture never visited Britain or any of the islands which constituted the British West Indies. However, his influence on the end of slavery in the British Empire and other European countries was most profound. This is because he led the largest and most successful slave revolt in history. Welcome to another episode of the Sankofa Pan-African series. Please, if you have not yet subscribed, take a moment to do so. Thank you. François-Dominique Toussaint, who later adopted the name Louverture, is believed to have been born a slave around 1743 on a plantation in St Domingo. Toussaint's parents were people who had been captured from Africa. Some accounts report that he was educated by a man named Pierre Baptiste, who was a free man. He also received some education from Jesuit missionaries and had medical knowledge based on African and Creole herbal medical techniques. Now, Saint Domingue, as Haiti was then known, produced coffee, sugar, cocoa, indigo, and was one of the most prosperous colonies in the world. However, the wealth of this colony depended on the blood and sweat of African slaves. Now, in spite of all the wealth that was being made by the French and other European colonists in Saint Domingue, the slaves in this colony suffered some of the worst treatments by both male and female colonizers. An exceptionally intelligent child, François-Dominique Toussaint had a good command of French in addition to Creole. He was also well informed about works of Enlightenment thinkers like Abe Renard, who wrote against slavery. Some accounts show that he gained his freedom around 1776 when he was in his early 30s. His freedom then allowed him to accumulate a level of wealth. Although some accounts try to deride his accumulation of wealth by saying that he made his fortune by running a plantation with the slaves. Now, while I'm not attempting to exonerate him, I think we should note that virtually all the founding fathers of the U.S. were slave owners. At that time in Saint Domingue, there could not have been very many other ways to make a livelihood. However, what Toussaint did, what makes him significant to us, is what he did with his wealth. Although he started out trying to bargain with slave owners for better conditions for enslaved people, he later changed and fought for complete abolition of slavery and independence for Saint Domingue. Now, starting around 1789, free people of color in Saint Domingue, like Tuson, were inspired by the French Revolution, which was going on in France, to demand freedom for all and equality. By August 1791, slaves who made up the majority of the population on the island carried out a voodoo ceremony to flag off a rebellion. Now, a few weeks after the rebellion started, Tuson, who was a pragmatic person, joined the rebellion, although by then he was already a free man. He started by serving as a doctor to the rebellious troops. And from this position, he rose to be one of the leaders of the rebellion. He rose to become a significant military leader and adopted the name Louverture, which has been translated into English to mean the person who opened the way. So I think the name must have been significant for him because of what he planned to do with the rest of his life. In order to drive home his point about freedom, Louverture used the same language that the revolutionaries in France were using to insist from the monarchs that they wanted to be treated with equality. So he used the same language that French revolutionaries in France used against the monarchic system to argue for the liberation of his own country. If the French thought equality was a necessity, he insisted that, enslaved people in Saint Domingue also deserved the same level of equality from their colonizers. So rather than support the call for freedom and equality by the slaves in Saint Domingue, France decided to send troops to fight the revolutionaries that was by that time being led by Toussaint Louverture. But the French army was soundly defeated. And by the end of 1791, the French were forced to abolish slavery on Saint Domingue. Now, since Spain, Britain, and other European countries which owned slave colonies had not yet abolished slavery at that time, Toussaint believed that the French revolutionaries in France would help him uphold the freedom that he and his people had gained in Saint Domingue. And just as he suspected, as soon as the British saw that the French had been defeated in Saint Domingue, they went all out to try and overtake the colony. Britain invested millions of pounds by sending soldiers to try and capture Saint Domingue and re-enslave the people. This was in 1793. The attempt ended up in an expensive and most humiliating failure for Britain, whose troops were forced to withdraw in 1798. Toussaint's rebels were able to defeat the British using what historian Sudir Hazar Rising describes as psychological warfare. By defeating the British army, Louverture showed Britain what enslaved people who were determined to fight for their freedom could achieve. Out of over 20,000 British soldiers sent to Saint Domingue during the 5 years of fighting, of trying to capture the colony, more than 60% of them were killed. The few who were left, some of the surviving British soldiers, officers, when they returned to Britain, were so overwhelmed by the determination and the way in which the rebels defeated them, that they joined the abolitionist movement, because they were convinced that the slaves who had defeated them deserved to be free. They had a right to an ability to run and determine their own affairs. After this victory against the British, the French made Toussaint Louverture deputy governor of the colony. But rather than just rest on the glory of being elevated to the position of deputy governor, he went after and conquered Santo Domingo, present day Dominican, which was then under Spanish rule. He proceeded on conquering that part of the colony. He proceeded to then ban slavery there as well, as a way of kind of maybe celebrating his victory over the Spaniards. Anyway, the revolt which Toussaint led lasted about 12 years, starting in 1791. It was the most sustained and most successful rebellion, slave rising in any part of the world. By 1801, Toussaint Louverture and others fighting for liberation had ended slavery on the island, and he was governor of the entire island, made up of French Saint Domingue and Santa Domingo. And for the first time anywhere in the northern hemisphere, Tuson created an atmosphere in which black people, people of mixed race, and white people coexisted as equals. It had never been heard of. He was, however, tricked and ousted by the French under Napoleon Bonaparte. Toussaint Louverture was deceived into attending a meeting where he was arrested and then sent to prison in France. He died there of pneumonia and malnutrition in April 1803. However, his immortal words ring true even today. And I quote, "They have in me struck down but the trunk of the tree. The roots are many and deep. They will shoot up again." Though he died in prison, the revolt which he led had far-reaching effects. It began the transformation of the French colony of Saint Domingo into the independent country of Haiti. He also wrote his country's first constitution. Most significantly, Toussaint Louverture's revolt undermined France as a major slave holding power. He also paved the way for Haitian independence, which allowed abolitionists in the British Parliament to defeat the arguments which had been put forward by pro-slavery politicians that if Britain abolished slavery or slave trade, then France, which was Britain's arch enemy, would take it over and become more powerful than Britain. Not long after Toussaint's death, like he had rightly predicted that others would rise, Haitian independence was attained in 1804 after the French army under Napoleon Bonaparte was thoroughly defeated by the black people in the colony. Now, their success in defeating Napoleon Bonaparte proved to enslaved people all over the Caribbean that they could rise up against oppression, fight for their freedom, and win. Toussaint and the people of Haiti proved to black people all over the world that they had the ability to withstand and defeat European might, even in spite of having very limited resources. I'd like to end this episode on this legendary figure with another of his famous quotes to remind us of our responsibility as Africans and people of African descent everywhere in the world. "I took up arms for the freedom of my color. It is our own. We will defend it or perish. Thank you very much for being a part of this episode of the Sankofa Pan-African series. Please subscribe if you've not yet done so. Give us a thumbs up if you like our videos, and feel free to share with your friends. See you next time.